Your annual report isn't just a public record of what's happened, it's a signal to the world of how clearly your organisation understands its own work. And yet, for many organisations, the annual report is treated like little more than a compliance exercise. Do you know what I mean? Something to be ticked off and filed away, never to be seen again until the next cycle comes around. And that's an understandable position for busy organisations because time and resources are stretched. But it also carries a risk because the words and information that go into an annual report don't disappear once the document is published. They form part of the permanent and public record of your organisation. That means it can be referenced, questioned, and scrutinised, and sometimes long after the people who approved them initially have moved on. And later, what felt like routine sign off at the time can later be read as a formal statement of fact, a governance commitment, or a claim someone expects to be able to hold the organisation to account on. It can be used as evidence. So the weight of an annual report isn't always felt at the time of writing. It's often felt much later. And that signal is read carefully by people who matter. Funders use it to decide whether to continue or to increase support. Boards use it to assess whether management and leadership have a clear grip on the organisation's direction. Partners use it to gauge whether this is an organisation worth aligning with. And communities use it to understand and to verify whether the work being done on their behalf is actually progressing. So the annual report doesn't just describe your organisation. In many ways, it represents it. My name's Vienna Richards, and I've worked for years in high risk and high pressure environments across public affairs, communications, that includes media, internal and external communications, as well as stakeholder engagement. And one thing I've seen is that organisations sometimes underestimate how much a poorly prepared annual report can cost them, not just in terms of reputation, but in terms of funding relationships, board confidence, and public trust. And this is what makes it particularly difficult because because often the work being done by many organizations is genuinely good. It's meaningful. People can document real impact. There's committed people. But if the report doesn't communicate that clearly, the work can appear scattered, unfocused, and harder to understand. And a weak report doesn't necessarily mean that it's been weak work and so on, but it can make good work look that way. And readers who are unfamiliar with an organisation, they'll form an impression based on what's in front of them. And if the report is hard to follow or inconsistent or light on the evidence, that becomes the impression, not the years of effort that the organisation has put behind a program, and certainly not the complexity of the environment or industry. People are looking at what's on the page in front. The focus, when all you've got is an annual report to assess an organisation, it's what's on those pages. And that's why evidence and responsible messaging, they're not just about communicating what you're doing, they're also about credibility. And clear messaging in your report means that a reader who's unfamiliar with your organisation can follow the report without needing to ask more and more questions or requiring additional explanation. They can understand what you set out to do, what you did, what changed as a result, and what comes next. And that's what an effective annual report can show people who don't know anything about your organisation and are seeking to learn about your industry. And the evidence means in your report means that the claims in the report are supported. They're grounded in something that the organisation can actually point to. And where appropriate and with appropriate consents, you also want to make sure in that report you've got data, case studies, and evaluations if they exist, whatever is appropriate to the context. It's really important if you are dealing with photographs and images of individuals, that you do get people's consent. If they're employees, normally that consent is signed when they begin their employment. That's usually part and parcel of the contracts people sign. But if they're members of the community or another organisation, then it is appropriate to ensure that you have actual written consent before their images are published in your annual report. And I need to say here that unsupported claims in a public accountability document, like an annual report, that puts your organisation at risk. Responsible messaging. That means that the report reflects an honest account of the year. You don't want to be writing, well, I don't recommend doing a promotional document that only tells the good news. Organisations that acknowledge complexity, challenge, or course correction in their report often come across as more credible, not less, because it signals that leadership understands the environment and the industry they're operating in and is prepared to be accountable for it. It shows a level of maturity for organisations operating under regulatory and legislative requirements. There are additional considerations that are worth addressing directly, and I'm going to address one that's really discussed openly, and that's around the sign-off process. An auditor would typically be required to review and certify the annual report, in particular, the financial sections. That process is important, necessary, and absolutely rigorous within its scope. But that scope is specific. The auditor is there to verify that the financial statements are accurate, that they comply with the relative accounting standards, and that they meet the required regulatory thresholds. That's what their sign-off means. From a communications perspective, in practice, it doesn't necessarily extend to the rest of the document. Let me explain. One of the most common assumptions and understandings in annual reporting is that the auditor's approval covers everything, that once the auditor has signed off, the report is effectively cleared. That's often the status quo. The auditor approved it. Surely that's sufficient, right? But here's the thing. Auditors are financial specialists. They're not communications professionals. Their role does not necessarily include assessing whether the narrative sections of the report are consistent, whether the language used could create reputational risk, and whether the program descriptions are accurate and appropriately evidenced, or whether the leadership messaging could be read in ways that create governance exposure. That's simply not what they're there to do. And if you have a different experience, by all means, please comment in this video. But this means, and so in many organisations, the non-financial sections of the annual report, which often make up the majority of the document, may receive far less scrutiny beyond the review and editing process than the financial tables sitting alongside them. The numbers get examined line by line. The narrative in many cases does not, unless you have an eagle-eyed attention to detail communications professional and or leader who is looking at that line by line, and everyone's applying those critical thinking skills. They become really critical during an annual report, so that you're not looking at it through rose-tinted glasses, but you're looking at it through managing risk and managing reputations and managing any issues that might come up as a result of something that people might have inadvertently gotten from the narrative, which may have not been intended. And so being able to address those matters before you ever publish is really helpful, and it promotes your credibility as well. But an auditor's role doesn't necessarily include reviewing the narrative and suggesting. That's certainly not been my experience. Or maybe they have done and they've just never had an issue with it. But so something to think about. If you don't have a process to ensure that that is being addressed, and someone who's eagle-eyed, attention to critical thinking skills are switched on, that's really important, because I think often the auditor's sign off can create the assumption, well, it does, that full coverage gave people confidence that the risks had already been managed. And yes, in the financial section, that's the role of the auditor, absolutely. But it's not necessarily one that you can apply always to, or often to, the narrative sections. And so annual reports don't disappear once they're published and released. They sit on websites. They're shared with funding bodies. If you're government funded, your annual report will also be released or requested by the relevant government ministries and agencies. And if it's and usually it's also tabled in Parliament, especially if you are an organisation created as a statutory company or corporation, that it's law that they are tabled in Parliament, along with any other regulatory documents that you're required to provide. And annual reports can be referenced in future funding applications. Sometimes they're picked up by the media and definitely scrutinised by stakeholders, including those who are not your primary audience. And so a report that doesn't hold up to that kind of ongoing attention can create problems later. For example, well, if it contains claims that cannot be substantiated, or messages or narrative in the report that contradicts other public statements, or information that was approved without sufficient care. This is why governance and approval processes matter just as much as the writing itself. For example, who is reviewing your annual report? Who signed it off? Has legal and finance and other departments had sight and review and approval of the sections that require their oversight? Has leadership read the full document and been provided with all the information from the various departments to be able to make an informed and provide informed feedback? These are some of the considerations and the questions that determine whether the report is genuinely ready to be a public document. And you want to make sure that you've got a strong enough annual report that can carry the weight of public or media scrutiny, that reflect your organisation. And one of the features of strong annual reports is that they reflect organisations that understand their own work clearly enough to be able to explain it to others. And if you can't explain it to others, I would say pause. And strong annual reports will have gathered the right evidence, and the teams will have had the right conversations before publishing, and the organisation is prepared to stand behind what the report says. That kind of credibility isn't built at the drafting stage of the annual report. And really need to stress that it's built on the preparation that comes well before. So before your organisation begins drafting, it's worth checking whether your evidence, the messages and approvals are strong enough to support the final report. Not just whether it will be written well, but whether it's ready to represent your organisation in public and to keep doing so long after it's been published. If you're not sure whether your organisation is ready to produce a report that will hold up and be credible, my annual report readiness checklist is a good place to start. It has 10 questions to help you identify what may need attention before drafting begins. You can find it through a link in the video description below. Until next time, thank you for your time. See you in the next video and take care.